I'll start answering by referring to a review in the UK, which was very complimentary about most of the stories, but it said the two commissioned stories, which I'd written to commission, didn't fit as well with the other ones I'd written to the theme of the collection, and it was intended as a criticism. And I quietly chuckled to myself because I thought, I wrote none of those stories intending them to fit together into a collection. There was no theme written in bold capital letters above my desk. So, in a way, if someone can say most of them do seem to fit together, I think that's simply because they came out of the same mind. They were written by me, and then gathered together. A few were thrown away. I had a couple of stories which had to be sort of taken out behind the barn and put out of their misery. And then the other ones were just gathered together that I've written over the last 3 or 4 years. And to be honest, and I think that creates, as it were, a kind of richer strand of DNA. If you constrain yourself by saying, I want to join these stories together, you might link them, but you don't get as broad a connection as you do just by writing what's important to you, writing the things that you can write best, and trust that your own set of beliefs and principles will rise up and tie them together.
So with this collection, it sounds like you're working on the stories individually, having no like grand plan, like no sense of like a whole collection, but then realizing in the edit or as the stories begin to kind of pile up, maybe what your thematic concerns are and maybe how they might complement one another and be in dialogue with one another.
Sometimes it's even later than that. Sometimes it's only when people read the stories or review the stories and they point out the themes which have been hitherto completely invisible to me. In fact, as we're talking now, I'm beginning to realize that one of the big themes which ties quite disparate stories together is the question of power, structures of power, who holds power, who suffers as a result of these structures of power. We talk about Greek myths, but I have a much broader interest in what I refer to generically as old stories. They may be from Chaucer, Shakespeare, they may be fairy tales, they may be Greek myths. I'm interested because they all have a resonance, even for readers who've never heard them before, because somehow even for non-bookish people, they're there in the wallpaper as a sort of faint ghost of an outline, aren't they? So when you use the stories, you've already got a leg up. You start with a slight advantage. But I'm interested not in retelling, but I'm interested in having an argument with those stories. Because as the narrator in the first story in the collection, the mother story, says towards the end, whenever she hears a glittering story now, she always wonders who wrote it and why, and where is her attention being taken away from. Stories are written by societies that have vested interests in certain people being at the top, and all stories tell you to look in a certain direction, and when you're looking in a certain direction, there are things happening in the background you're not meant to see. So I'm interested in going to those stories and looking at turning them round, seeing what's happening in the background, see whose stories aren't being told. I mean, in that particular story, which is a version of the Minotaur, I started to think about the plight of a profoundly disabled child who was seen as a monster. And then that gave me access into that story. So I get, as it were, the profit of using an old story. It has that resonance, but it gives me a chance to argue with those structures of power. And
that's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting.
Mythologies. And when I'm writing, for example, about British boarding schools in the 1970s, I realize as we're talking now that that's what binds the two together.
Yeah, because I think I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, it's interesting that you consider these stories to be arguments or dialogues with these Greek myths and these points of origin rather than like a retelling, which is the way that it's often characterized. And I think it makes more sense that you would be, like sizing them up and trying to, make them new, but also like push back against them. And the story that you just referred to about the boarding school called My Old School, which is also a great Steely Dan song, by the way. I feel like it's one of my
It is
favorites.
indeed, yes.
Yeah. But I felt like that story stood out a little bit for not having as explicit a connection to Greek mythology. But as you say, thematically, it is tied to, for example, the mother story, which is like such a deeply powerful and like richly imagined, almost like fairy tale, uh, and very haunting. These stories are often very haunting. Do you have, and you're also very good at writing gore, which I think was pointed out in one of the reviews that I read. Do you have a love of horror? Do you have a love of, like, do you like to read those kinds of things, or you love horror movies?
I can't bear horror movies. I'm afraid I have to watch horror movies during the afternoon with all the lights on. I'm far too sensitive. Um, and I don't like horror with a capital H. I do quite like gore. I recently read Tender is the Flesh by Agostina Bazterrica, which was about a society which has evolved a kind of late capitalistic, cannibalistic industry of eating people, farming people. I do like gore. I think more generally, what I really like is bodies. I like stories which exist both in rooms and houses and in places and in physical bodies. When I read literature which is mostly conversation, which is ideas, people talking and thinking, it seems to drift free of reality for me. I want it anchored. And I love the fact that the human body is both the thing that makes our lives possible and yet the thing which traps us at the same time. It's both a vehicle and a prison cell at the same time. And gore is just one part of being fascinated with the human body.
So when you like think of this collection in its totality, I know we've talked about how things sort of coalesce and it's hard to point to a single point of origin. Like, did you creatively, at least for most of these stories, begin by saying, okay, well, I want to have an argument with the myth of the Minotaur? You know what I'm saying? Like, did you begin there with Greek myths? Were you clearly a lover of these myths and seem to be interested in not just Greek mythology, but mythology broadly? Was that how it unfolded for you, or was it different than that?
Oh my God! I wish there was a plan to how my career happens. I, you
It
hear so
seems to be
many.
working out.
It does. It does. Somehow, you often hear writers talking as if they have a grand plan, as if they are Churchill standing over a sort of map of Europe during the Second World War, pushing little battleships around with some great plan. I often feel I'm stumbling through a forest at night, desperately trying to look for something that will work. And you're right; it does seem to work out in the end. But it's dictated purely by what I can find to write about that works. I never really start with an idea of what I want to do with my writing. I start out with a really deep need to find something that will work on paper. And and not many things do. I'm a great thrower away of poor beginnings.
How do you know when something's working?
Ultimately, and I've been going back to this image for about 20 years now because someone asked me shortly after Curious Incident came out, and it's still the best image I can find. It's about reading a paragraph back and feeling something absolutely right about it, which feels like a well engineered door on a large German car closing snugly into place. That sense of something very well engineered. And if there's that rightness to it, then I think that's it. And
You know,
that's strange, of course, because that's not really anything to do with the subject or the ideas or the characters. It's about the experience of reading.
it's interesting to hear you make that comparison because there's a something that David Foster Wallace said years ago that has always stuck in my brain, where he referred to the exact same process, but he called it like chasing the click, like when things like click into place, kind of like
Mm,
the door of the well-engineered German automobile. And
absolutely.
it's a very familiar feeling to a writer when you get a paragraph just just so, and you can't find anything to change, I guess, is maybe the sensation, right? You got it. You got the words in the right order.
And there's a sense of the circle being closed as well, because I, like almost every writer, I write because I want to create for complete strangers that peculiar intimate pleasure I get from reading when it feels perfect. So yes, I'm just trying to do for others what I get from reading when it's really working well.
So speaking of when writing is really working well, I want to point to some other inspirations and influences that had some impact on this collection and have had an impact on, I think, your career more broadly. The first is Virginia Woolf,
Hmm.
whose I believe her first published story is you wrote an homage. I believe the last story in your collection is an homage to her first published story. Is that correct?
That was It was a republication of her first story, which was also the first book published by the Hogarth Press. So I wrote a short story to sit alongside A Mark on the Wall, her first published story. There
And
was
the
a
story where your story is called Saint Bride's Bay.
Mhm.
And can you just talk about the impact that Virginia Woolf has had on you and why you respond so strongly to her work?
There's something she does which is can only be done in the novel. It can't be done on stage, on film, on the radio, and she does it in a way that no one else does. She inhabits no, she inhabits, she articulates what it's like to be a human consciousness moment to moment. What it's like to be inside a brain looking out at the world around you, and to sort of straddle that border between the inside and the outside. Um, she does it not only with individuals, with groups as well. Into the Lighthouse, for example, she has a point of view which moves around busy rooms like a sort of a little bit of ball lightning or a will-o'-the-wisp, and it goes into someone's head and out again, and then into another person's head, and you don't really know at times who's thinking. And the whole room, a family, a group of friends, will have a group consciousness, and she's able to be that group consciousness. And I don't know any other writer who can quite do that. There's an image which I often reach for, which is she wrote, I think, in Moments of Being, about being in the nursery, in the house in St Ives that the family had when she was very young. And it's that sensation of being inside a room, hearing the noise of the ocean and the people playing on the beach. And she talks about the yellow blind being blown back and forth by the wind, dragging this little wooden acorn on the end of its string. And for me, that's an image of what it's like to inhabit a human mind. You're on the inside, you're conscious of everything on the inside. There's a window onto the outside world where everything's bright and noisy and people are having fun. You're both contained and protected, but also somehow elsewhere and slightly isolated from that world. And it's the yellow blind. She can articulate that sensation of the yellow blind in a way that no one else can.
I wonder what it is. Like, what does she have access to, or what did she have access to, do you think, that other writers have not, that allowed her to be able to do that?
Very difficult question. And my answer is an answer I quite often come up with when I'm particularly talking about work that I like. The fact that I'm unable to explain how something happens is part of the appeal. When someone takes me to a place where I run out of words, that is a very precious feeling. and is part of the appeal. And I want to back off slightly because if I try too hard to dig into that experience and understand it, it might break. I'd rather leave it there and say she takes me to the edge of something beyond words. And quite how she's able to do that, I don't know. As you say, ultimately, it's all about the right words in the right order. It's both, on the one hand, mere plumbing with language, and at the same time, it is borderline magical.
George Eliot is another influence.
I would say not so much these days. Um, much as her humanity, her generousness, I find inspiring. But what's peculiar about George Eliot for me is that you can go through my whole copy of Middlemarch and perhaps find two passages underlined. She's not a great phrase maker, and there are not many writers I love deeply who don't make good phrases. Um, all my favourite books have scribbles all the way through them and have lines underlined, sometimes copied and pasted out in one of my scrapbooks as well, because as my wife will sometimes point out, I can fall deeply in love with a book and remember sentences from it and have forgotten the plot altogether. Because what's really important for me is that sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph sensual pleasure of reading.
So when as you're reading books and you're underlining, is it just like something strikes you, you like it, you underline it, you might copy it and paste it into your scrapbook, as you said. Is there anything more like rigorous to it than that in terms of how you might deconstruct it in an effort to then apply it to your own work? Do you know what I'm saying?
No. And this is one of the great, I think every writer who also teaches writing is aware of this deep paradox. And I teach at least once a year for the Arvon Foundation. So it's a residential, they're residential courses for 5-6 day long, two writers, tutors in residence with them. And we'll do workshops all morning and tutorials all afternoon. And during the workshops, something extraordinary always happens. And it's one of the reasons why I recommend people go on these courses. We'll all do an exercise, and many of these people will never have written before in their lives. I always enjoy working with complete beginners because they have no fear. They're willing to jump off the top board. And unlike writers who've got some good feedback, they're not like limpets that have to be pried away from the harbour wall and made to be more free again. When we do the exercise, if you have 16 people in a room, everyone reads out their work, just a couple of paragraphs. I can guarantee that every time 1, 2, 3 people will read something out that is absolutely right. And you can hear the quality of the silence in the room change. Everyone moves metaphorically to the front of their seats a little. And that is what I'm always looking for. And it's really, really hard to predict in advance what writing will do that to a room full of strangers. It's really easy to point out the flaws in someone's writing, the reason why that's never going to happen when you read it out. But to predict in advance what is going to create that special silence in a room is almost impossible.
Is there a way to diagnose it in terms of like the qualities of it? Is it true? Is there emotional power in it? Some sort of deep human truth or a kind of courage in the work that delves into, for example, the kinds of hidden truths that exists for us psychologically and emotionally. Like usually what I always say is that a good writing changes my temperature. Like I feel my kind of temperature go up if I'm reading something and I'm leaning in and I'm suddenly absorbed into it. But I'm just wondering, in your experience of having taught these classes and having worked in this profession for a long time, if you can locate what it is about those kinds of pieces of writing that cause us to lean forward.
I'm not sure I can. And when you talked about your temperature going up, in a way, that's as mystical as anything I've said. There's something hard hard to hard to grasp about it. It's rather like music, isn't it? If you say, why does a piece of music grab you, you'd have to say, well, lots of things are happening at the same time here. There's there's maybe lyrics, there's there's harmony, there's melody, there's rhythm, there's timbre, there's various instruments, particularly if it's a multi-instrument piece. And if someone said, why does that particular version of that tune grab you, it'll be very, very hard to say because so many things are going on. And I think with writing, something similar is happening. There are ideas, there are characters, there's a story, but there's also the arrangements of words on the page as well. And all these things are happening in parallel. And when they come together, something extraordinary happens. It's like that tune that tugs your heartstrings, but there's no music. It's just words on the page.
It's so fascinating to me why certain works of art have such deep resonance and wide resonance. I think about like musically, just to point to like a super obvious example, like the Beatles. Something about that combination, something about the harmony of those voices, something about the songs that they built just connect with people and continue to all over the world, cross culturally, the whole thing.
And of
And
course, when something gets to that level of fame, something else happens as well. It's not like sitting in a room and chancing upon something that will touch someone's heart. When you get to a Beatles level, they create the cultural future in which they are listened to. And I mean, that happens for all great art, doesn't it? It alters the culture and it becomes part of the way we appreciate all music. It's hard to listen to any popular music now without somewhere in the back of your mind the Beatles playing.
yeah, it's like, yeah, like you say, it gets to a certain level and it kind of becomes like its own feedback loop. It becomes like self-propelling.
Mhm.
It gets beyond like no one needs to push it anymore. You know what I'm saying? Like it kind of pushes itself.
It also becomes part of the context for everything else. And I think, in a way, that's one of the reasons I'm attracted to those old stories as well, because even though we might have forgotten all these stories, they are part of the context. They might have mulched down into a kind of cultural compost heap, but they're still there. They still create the way we respond to everything else.
Yeah, I wonder why do you think those stories, those Greek myths in particular, have endured for so long?
I think there are two things. There's something about the myths that we respond to deeply, but also though they are so widespread within Western Judeo-Christian culture now, that they're not just things that we respond to. They're the part of the machinery we use to think about the world. They're no longer things we pick up, just stories out there. They are part of the inside of our heads. They're the way we think of other things. They are the context.
And like they also often involve uh, animals. They have a fairy tale like quality. You write very beautifully about animals in this collection. You write about the natural world very well. I'm curious to know about your do you have a strong love of animals? Do you have lots of pets? These are the things that occurred to me as I was reading. Are you somebody who spends a lot of time in the outdoors?
Um, I I I feel happiest when and sadly I've had long COVID for 2 years now, so I'm not able to do it. I feel at my happiest when I've gone for a run in the middle of nowhere and I just slow down in the middle of the run and I'm walking through a wood and there's no one else around. And I think everyone who runs, particularly people who run out of cities and people who run in the countryside, running quietens down that overly human, frantic top end of your mind. And once you've run for about 40 minutes, your inner dog takes over. The human part shuts off and your inner dog takes over. And I find that an intensely blissful experience. And I miss it greatly at the moment.
So I want to talk with you about your career, like in a larger sense. You've had a lot of success in writing and publishing that I think it's like what most writers would dream of, being able to make a living at it, and a very good living, having a book, having a book like Curious Incident, which connected in such a huge way, probably beyond your imagination. Did you have that? You could not have had that expectation for that particular book when it was published. It's not a book that I think on the surface, and very, very few books are, but if you just describe that book in a nutshell, I don't know if anyone's going to go, that's going to be a huge hit. And yet it is a book that endures.
Various people said to me at the time, "Did you know it was going to be a hit?" And I had to say, no, it was a story set in a very tedious English town about the teenage son of a plumber and heating engineer, and a dead dog. It had absolutely nothing about it which suggested anything about what was going to happen. Only slowly, in retrospect, do I realize certain inherent qualities help propel it to where it's got to now. And I didn't even see them at the time. One of them, for example, was the fact that although I'm profoundly in love with the English language, that book is not. It's not very connected to the language in which it's written. Christopher, the narrator, doesn't really have an interest in language qua language, which means that it can be translated into so many other languages and lose almost nothing, which is quite rare for a book, and particularly odd for a book by a writer who loves the English language. I also realised that so many things are left out. Christopher, he recites the events in a way which is so stripped down that readers fill in the gaps themselves, and they get to the end, and I think they feel an ownership about the experience because they've created that experience themselves to a very large extent, in a way that happens with very, very few other books. Quite often early on, I used to ask people who'd enjoyed the book what Christopher looked like, and they had quite specific ideas of what he looked like. But of course, there's no mention of what he looks like in the book because he has no interest in looking in a mirror. He has no interest in how he seems to other people. But I realized people had themselves built this picture up. So I think they own the reading experience in a way. To go back to David Foster Wallace, for example, it's the exact opposite of David Foster Wallace. I mean, he was a genius, and he did some extraordinary things. But every time I read him, I thought, here is a writer who does not trust the reader to get it. He is not going to leave any gaps or holes whatsoever. He is going to bludgeon you into admitting how astonishing this world he's created is. Curious Incident was the exact opposite. It was peppered with holes all the way through. And I didn't realize until afterwards how much readers enjoy that, how much they enjoy filling in those holes themselves.
It's also a novel, The Curious Incident is, that features a neurodivergent protagonist. I know a lot has been made of this, both positive and negative. People have a lot of thoughts about this. When you were writing the book, it was a different time, I think, in our cultural understanding of these issues and what they mean and what like neurodivergence entails, and I don't know, all that comes along with it. I'm curious to know where you stand with it now, like, and how you experience it as an author, and how you were able to render it so well.
People still come up to me and have, well, not come up to me. I come into contact with people who are very critical of it, and I always have conversations with them, and it's always really interesting. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that I did not sit down to write a picture or of a person with ASD who was neurodivergent. Several things happened. I started off by I wanted, and this is a slightly shameful thing to admit, especially for someone who loves dogs. I came up with the image of the dog with a fork through it, and I wanted a voice that somehow made that funnier than it was already. We've talked about my love of gore. I found it intrinsically grimly humorous, but then I realized if it was described in the voice of a person who didn't understand that it was funny, it was somehow even funnier. It was deadpan. So I wanted a deadpan voice. I was also obsessed as a teenager with maths and science, and when he came together as a character, I thought, my goodness, this is a very rare chance that I have got to indulge my love of maths and science. So that is me. That is me. So in that sense, half of all those essays are a sort of delayed autobiography of my 16-year-old self. Um, and when I sought around for other character traits for Christopher, I found them in my own extended family and in my friends. And to be honest, I live in Oxford. There's no shortage of people who are brilliant neurodivergent academics here. There is a persistent cry out there among people who are angered by the book, saying he did no research, to which my answer is those people are all around me. Half of the book is me. The rest of the book is friends and family. I don't have to do research because it's my life. I meet people like that all the time. I think it's also vitally important that those character traits and habits were all from real people that I knew. None of those people would accept a disability label. Only when you put those things together do you create a person who has some fairly difficult problems in their life. And I think that's really important, that there isn't a sort of a bridge you cross between ability and disability. There are just many different traits, habits, beliefs, principles, none of which are intrinsically problematic. And it's only the combination for Christopher that makes certain things in his life hard.
So you write this book. You dream of any book you write finding a big readership. I think that's at least part of why we do this work. We want to be in communication with readers, and to have it then go on to have such an extraordinary life as a work of fiction. Very few works of literary fiction find an audience the way that The Curious Incident did. I'm curious to know, at what point in the publication life cycle did it begin to become apparent to you that this was connecting?
I'm going to tell you about two events, one very early and one much later. Early, before it was published by anyone, I was in a taxi with my wonderful agent, Claire Alexander, with her small Bichon Frise, driving through London with her dog drinking from a bowl of water on the floor of a black London taxi cab. And she was having a phone call about the book. I was a complete ingenue at this time, so I didn't really understand what was going on. She finished the phone call and she said, "Mark, that was the live Italian auction for the book." And I said, you'll have to explain that to me. What do you mean, the live auction? I felt as if I'd passed through a portal into a sort of Woody Allen-esque version of my own life. And I think, well, we both knew then that something extraordinary was happening for reasons we didn't quite understand. So that's when I realized that it would take off as a book. There was several years later, I remember sitting in the circle on the first night of when the Simon Stevens stage adaptation of the play transferred to the West End. So it had been very successful on stage, but then it had moved from a theatre in the round to a big proscenium theatre, which is itself a big movement. And a lot of good plays don't really survive that. You need much more energy to fill a proscenium stage theatre. And it was clearly working. And I remember very vividly thinking, this is a very, very robust story. I mean, a lot of the play script is literally taken from the novel. So you listen to a lot of novel on stage, and it works as a script. And I thought at one and the same time, this is what every writer dreams of. I think this novel might actually have a life after I'm dead. And I thought, isn't that what we all dream of? But all I felt at the time was this sudden wash of sadness at the idea of me being dead and my novel sort of happily tripping off into the future without me. So it was a very strange feeling. I mean, I think that's true of all big ambitions. When you it's chasing after them, which is what makes life meaningful, isn't it? When you get there, you often discover that it's not what it looked in the distance. So I'm in that very peculiar situation of having written something which I think will still be read after I'm dead. And the strange thing is, it's not consoling at all.
That's good
That
to
sounds
know.
that sounds appallingly. That sounds terribly selfish, doesn't it? I'm just being honest about how I felt watching in the theatre. But I think it's to look at it another way. It's like having a child that has grown up and left home and really doesn't need me anymore. It can look after itself. It's absolutely fine. Doesn't need anything from me anymore.
Yeah, yeah. That was kind of like the next thing I was going to say is that this book, I believe it was published in 2003.
That's right. Yes,
So it's 21.
I know. Yeah,
And it's a grown up and it's out there and it can sort of fend for itself and has taken on a life of its own, right? It's got its own existence sort of separate from you, as you were just saying. And I'm wondering if the great success of that book and the rare success of that book, if there's any, is there a complicated side to that? I think we can all imagine the great sides of having a book go out into the world and find such a huge and enthusiastic readership, and to then, be adapted for the stage with such success. That's kind of the dream. Are there any downsides?
I I make sure there aren't by, and this may seem graceless, but I distance myself a little from it. It would be very easy for my job to become the author of Curious Incident. I mean, I don't do any events based around the book now. I realised that if I wasn't careful, it would just take over both my diary and the inside of my head. Um, I have to just, and it doesn't need me anymore. So I have taken a rather stern vow that I will concentrate on new things, and I think that's helped. I mean, I'm very aware that it could it could be the world's largest gold-plated ball and chain, um, but I'm very grateful for what it's done. But I'm going to be looking in the other direction. I don't think about it too much. I deliberately don't think about it too much.
That seems healthy.
I think it's the only way to go. Although I think we both know people whose in all sorts of arts whose careers have turned into the creator of X, which happened 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I think it can be easy to kind of fall into the trap of sort of just playing the hits or just leaning on this big hit and maybe not being productive. I guess that could be a temptation. But psychologically and creatively, it seems like the only way to go is to just keep pressing forward and to keep trying to make stuff.
Yeah, and I think deep down there's a borderline, well, I have a borderline pathological urge to make things. Sometimes I hate that blank piece of paper, but if I don't get to the end of the day without having created some small new thing, I feel restless and unused.
Do you work most days?
Yeah, I try to. I try to. I'm lucky in that I paint and draw and illustrate as well, and that's a great boon because it allows me to make something new without using any words. I think the part of my brain that uses words gets tired after a while, but the part of my brain that wants to make something carries on wanting to make something. But you can draw a picture without without letting a single sentence flow through your head.
Yeah, they're nice complementary activities, visual art and writing. I wish I
Mm.
had more of a gift as a visual artist, but I don't even think you necessarily need to be super gifted at it to benefit from it as a writer. You know what I'm saying? To kind of like turn away from the page and go to the canvas, or just go to your pad of paper, and to start drawing something. I think it might ventilate the the writing part of you, and then maybe even allow your subconscious mind to work on problems that might exist within a text, in some kind of subconscious way. Does that square with your experience?
I suspect there are quite a lot of writers out there who do something manual and artistic on the side. Arthur Miller used to make furniture, didn't he? And I know that Philip Pullman, for example, I know he's a very gifted woodworker, and I suspect that part of the pull of that for him is the ability to switch off the words and just make.
So, when it comes to your creativity and this impulse that you have, I mean, you mentioned that you've been battling long COVID for the past 2 years. And then I also read that in February of 2019, you underwent a triple heart bypass, which is a major surgery. And
Yes.
I'm wondering how all of this has affected your creativity and maybe your perspective on life and work.
Um, it's affected my perspective on life in one major way, in that, and this is right. This is not immediately connected to writing. I'm no longer frightened of dying. I feel I was brushed by the hem of the robe of the Grim Reaper and came away absolutely fine. I think this is, having talked to other people, this is quite a common experience. You can spend a lot of your life being frightened of getting old, of finitude, of the fact that life doesn't go on forever. But then when you're wired up to all these machines in a hospital bed, you realize you're still you. It's an ordinary experience like everything else. So in that sense, it's made me much happier, more grounded. I don't have any dark forebodings in the way I used to. I don't think that's changed the way I write, though. Um, what was difficult was the brain fogs which came afterwards. It is exasperating as a writer not to be able to read or write for very long periods.
And I also read, I'm forgetting the publication that this profile was done in, but it was beautifully done. And you were talking about experiences with bipolar 2,
Mhm.
and the ways in which that can sometimes impact your ability to write. And I think it was exacerbated maybe by the pandemic. I mean, there's been quite a lot coming at you these last few years, it seems like.
Yes, I've become a connoisseur of varieties of brain fog. I had the post-operative one is known as pump head, having been on a ventilator, and then my uh, mood stabilizing drugs no longer worked, and I had to go through a whole buffet of different ones to get one that worked. And then long COVID hit me. So I've had three distinct and yet not very distinct types of brain fog. It's made me realize that writing, although it's a little bit like being a surgeon or a pilot, you don't want to go to work unless you're operating at 95% of your capacity. The difference is that, unlike surgeons and pilots, no one dies if you get it wrong. You just write absolute rubbish. But it's not worth writing if you've only got 80% of your brain working. I think if you're doing a lot of other jobs, you could probably get away with it. You could turn up at the office and turn in a decent day's work. But substandard writing just gets thrown away.
That's true. That's true. You have to be, I mean, that's what I find too. I sort of marvel at people who, I mean, I think it's very few and far between, but people, these maybe apocryphal stories of writers who drink while writing. I've never understood that. I have to be like decently caffeinated and clear as a bell to get anything worth reading on the page.
Well, there's a
And
parallel. There's a parallel with writers who have quite serious psychiatric illnesses as well. I mean, the two quite often go hand in hand. But the work gets done in the periods of sanity. The work does not get done when the mind is malfunctioning. And maybe those periods of insanity gift something to the writer, and maybe the time when you're stable and sane is doubly precious because you know it's limited. But people are rarely creative when the mind is going wrong.
I read that you have spent several years volunteering as a Samaritan's listener. I think this is something that might be particular to the UK,
Yeah.
but I found it very moving to learn about this. It's such a lovely thing to do. Can you first just describe what that means for people who might not have a frame of reference, and then I'd also love to know like what this experience of doing this volunteer work might have taught you, not only about yourself, but maybe about human beings generally. And if there's been any, like, has it redounded creatively? Like, has there been some impact that this volunteer work might have on you as an artist?
So the Samaritans are an organisation throughout the UK and Ireland. We're a free telephone listening service, not just for people who are suicidal, but for people who are in distress. And they can ring up for as long and as often as they like. And we simply listen without judgment, without trying to cheer them up, without trying to move them on. And if they want, it can be completely anonymous and confidential. So we end up listening to, as you can imagine, a huge range of people with a huge range of problems. It could be abusive relationships. It could be abuse they've experienced in the past, sexual, physical. We listen to a lot of prisoners, for example, from prisons. Prisoners will ring us up. We listen to a lot of people who are suffering from serious long-term mental health problems. People who are in debt. People who have legal problems, people who are homeless. I sometimes describe it as like a little advent calendar, and each little door you open is a window onto a random life of someone in this country. And they could be a Lord Chief Justice, or they could be someone with drug problems sleeping on the street. A lot of the volunteers talk about it being a privilege. That makes it the word feels wrong to me, but I find it deeply moving and pleasurable just to listen to people. And what we all learn as volunteers, is that most people, particularly people who are lonely or who are suffering, rarely get listened to, genuinely listened to. Once you've been a volunteer for a while, you'll hear other conversations, and you'll hear people saying things like, "Oh, something similar happened to me," or "Tomorrow will be another day," or "Look on the bright side," all of which boil down to, "I feel uncomfortable listening to what you're telling me right now." And what we do is completely the opposite. I mean, however dark or difficult someone's experiences are, we will always listen. So if someone says, "I'm thinking of taking my own life," and they ring up, we will just say, "Tell me about it. Tell me what's led you to feel like this. Do you have a plan? What are you thinking of doing, and why? I'm here to listen for as long as you need." And that is hopefully it's a powerful experience for the person ringing up, but it's a powerful experience for us as well, just to be able to listen. It involves doing, paradoxically, very, very little. And yet it works so often.
I was going to say, do you ever have an impulse to be like, please don't do that? Like, or to not to get diagnostic, but to try to come up with some kind of solution for people. That's not part of your purview in this role. You're
No,
just
no,
there.
it's explicitly forbidden. And it doesn't take long doing this kind of volunteering when you realize, for you to realize why it's forbidden and why not doing it is so helpful. People are being given advice all the time. What people have almost never given is space and someone who will genuinely listen. Um, and paradoxically, if someone rings up absolutely at the end of their tether, they can't take any more, it is much better for you to say, tell me all about it. Tell me why everything's gone wrong. Tell me why you feel the way you do, rather than wanting to, as it were, help, unquote. Because what can you do? What can most of us do for most other people? Very, very little. And it turns out that, and this has certainly sort of transferred to my life outside Samaritans as well. We can do very little to help one another, but we can always listen. And it's a sort of uplifting shock to realize how much you can help just by listening.
It also speaks to the ameliorative effects of storytelling and the way that, like letting somebody tell their story, that alone can have such a medicinal impact. And like you say, oftentimes that's all it takes. Just letting somebody explain what is going on with them and unburden themselves of this inner narrative can bring them back.
But there's another level as well. It's not just letting someone talk, which we do, but we'll also tend to, the phrase we tend to use in our particular branch is steer into distress. It's very easy when people are telling their stories to become chatty and anecdotal. When we're listening, we'll always say, hang on a second, you rushed over something there which sounds painful, or you've missed out something there. Go back, tell me about that. I have learned that there are a lot of profoundly distressing things in people's lives, but turning away from them never lessens that distress. But paradoxically, as it were, looking the monster in the face is always worthwhile. The image I often find myself reaching for is that horror movie scene in which the camera pans down an old hotel corridor with the lights stuttering on and off, and you're chasing something in the distance. You know that round the next bend is some creature, but it only remains frightening as long as you don't see it. Because whenever you see the creature, if it's for more than 1 second, you realise it's paste and makeup. It's someone in a rubber mask, but that's true of life as well. If someone is terminally ill and they're frightened of dying, everyone around them in daily life will be trying to distract them, will want to talk about something else. And it's often a relief for that person to be able to just talk about death. What is it that frightens them? To have someone say, tell me about it. Tell me why you're frightened.
Well, it kind of reminds me of your experience as you were describing it earlier with triple bypass, where you really, your fear of death dissipated when you came into contact with it. Like that's the experience that you were just talking about with the monster in the hallway and around the bend, and suddenly coming face to face with it and realizing that the fear was overblown.
Although I have to say, when I was in hospital, I was also much more logical than that. And when I met my surgeon, I said, I want to know your figures. How many people have survived this operation that you're doing? And he said to me, he was very honest. I've found that doctors really like patients who are genuinely interested in what they do, as opposed to people who don't want to know. And he said, if I remember correctly, since coming to this hospital, I've done 140 of these operations. One of my patients died. he was a very sick man who came in as an emergency, and we had to operate there and then. And I said, "Thank you. That's what I need to know." So yes, it was in part having death standing near me, but it was also in part brutal logic being applied to me and my surgeon.
So I was prepping for the conversation and read about something that you had done professionally early in your adult life, I think early on in your career, and that was to have spent some time as a live-in volunteer uh, for a man with disabilities. I believe he had late-stage multiple sclerosis, and you also worked as a community volunteer, often with people with disabilities. And there are echoes of this, I think, in your fiction, maybe distant echoes, but I kind of feel that now that I know that about you. I'm also the parent of a child with disabilities, so I'm always it's always nice to hear about people doing nice things for people with disabilities. The disability community is often overlooked, too much
Absolutely.
so. Maybe not as much in the UK, I don't know, but certainly here in the United States, I feel that. And I just like to hear you talk about those experiences and what their impact has been on you through the years.
I guess they were just normal, you know? I mean, that's, as you probably know, I mean, I don't know the details of your family life, but it's a part of ordinary life, isn't it? And often other problems are bigger than that in people's lives. I was a live-in volunteer with this young man who was effectively quadriplegic as a result of MS. But that was not the biggest problem in his life. The biggest problem in his life was that he recently joined a very angry evangelical church whose main sport was expelling one member after another into eternal darkness. And that was the way he got some certainty into his life. But that caused more problems for him and everyone around him than his physical disability. Um, Similarly, the co-volunteer who was working with me was also a member of the same church and had been a sort of street drinker and had come off the street, got a housing association flat, and while he was going cold turkey, so he told me, Jesus appeared to him in person and told him to go and work with Robert, who I was looking after. Um, he was a walking disaster. You know, every plate he washed, he broke. Every jumper he washed, he shrank. He was addicted to Nurofen. It made me realize that sometimes at the very blackest moments, things are quite funny. And it made me realize that, contrary to that rather persistent stereotype that disability confers a kind of nobility on people, even people with disabilities are just like the rest of us. They're as likely to be pains in the arse as the average person you meet in the street. They're as likely to be ill-tempered and difficult to be with. And that was true when I moved down to London and started working as a volunteer with mostly with teenagers and kids who had a range of learning difficulties and physical disabilities.
What drew you to that line of work?
Um, I had been sent away to a boarding school and then had 3 years at Oxford. And I felt I'd spent too much time doing stuff which was about me. I wanted I wanted to, as it were, sort of flush myself out of myself. If that, I'm searching for an image here. I was full of myself. I needed to be dedicate several years to other people to restore some kind of balance, I think.
That's noble. At least you knew you were full of yourself, or too me focused. A lot of people don't realize it until it's too late. But uh, had to have been of benefit to you, I would imagine. I feel like when you do work in service of other people, it tends to be positive.
I
Uh,
I think a lot of people. Well, it cuts both ways, doesn't it? I look at some people and I think you could do with a kind of social service boot camp. It'd be good for you, but unfortunately, to be working with other people, those poor other people will also have to put up with you as well. So I wouldn't necessarily wish those people on them.
but it seems like this part of you that seeks to be of service to others and maybe to be of service to people in particular need, like overlooked people, people who are struggling in an acute way. This seems like it's part of who you are. It's part of how you orient yourself to life. And it seems like it's part of like like maybe the creative ecosystem that you're sort of cultivating for yourself. Like, is that a fair characterization? Like, I feel like, I've talked to so many different writers over the years, some of whom, for example, are runners, others of whom have a day job that they don't want to quit because they feel like it serves them. And if they only had writing to focus on, it would somehow be overwhelming. You hear people and everyone's got a particular puzzle that they're trying to fit the pieces together in order to make things work. Uh, am I saying something that rings true to you in terms of how you are able to get the writing work done? Do you feel like if you did not do, for example, the Samaritans listening, that it would potentially have a negative impact on your ability to get words on the page?
I think I'm earning too many moral points here. I mean, I do it because I get pleasure. I It's a mixture of I'm genuinely interested in other people's lives, um, and both on a sort of a warm, squishy, empathetic level, but also on a sort of a level of utter fascination with the deep strangeness of other people. So I almost never finish my weekly Samaritan's shift without feeling uplifted or better in some way. So I don't think it plays the role you're thinking about. I The thing that plays that role is really grim household chores. Whenever I'm cleaning out the back of when I'm cleaning out the compost bin, as I was this morning, I'm thinking this is probably useful for me. This will anchor me. I remember a story. Alan Bennett, the playwright who lives in Camden, and I remember him talking about on a Sunday morning after a heavy sort of Saturday night, he was always used to have to take a bucket of hot soapy water out to his front step to swill down the sick off the pavement. And he says, I always think to myself, I bet Tom Stoppard never has to do this. So I do think that hot bucket of soapy water is a useful thing to have in your life, just to stop you drifting away. It keeps you anchored.
So I always ask people at the end of our time together if they are working on anything new. It's fine if you're not, if you're just celebrating Dogs and Monsters. But I'm wondering, do you have another iron in the fire? Is there another book in the works?
Well, the iron has gone into the fire and come out. I won't tell you too much about it, but I've actually started and finished another book. I set myself an exercise, an exercise in writing around and despite the fog. I realised that I was having trouble conceiving of long narrative arcs, so I started writing something in very small chunks, and polishing those until they worked, and not thinking about structure. And without going into details, suffice to say that somehow that structure looked after itself. It's something slightly autobiographical, and it also combines my illustration as well. It's not quite the graphic novel I've always secretly wanted to write, but it's a couple of steps in that direction.
So just to try to get a clearer picture, like is it a work for adults? Is it young adult? Is it
It's for adults, but I'm deliberately giving you a foggy, misty, unclear picture there because
okay?
I'm gonna hang on to the details for the moment. But there is another book, and it's finished, and it will be published both in the UK and the US as well.
Does it have a name?
It does, but I don't think that'll be the finished name yet. So let's I will draw a veil over that.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. It is an absolute pleasure to meet you and to have the chance to talk with you and to spotlight your new story collection in the book club. I'm grateful for the time, and I congratulate you and wish you well on this next mysterious, as yet officially untitled project.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.